Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And in today's video, we're going to be looking at slope-intercept form. Now, this is going to be a bit of a review from grade 8 and grade 7, but slope-intercept form, everyone remembers the equation of a line is in the form of y is equal to mx plus b, where x and y are your dependent and independent variables, so these change based on the question, and you're usually solving for y. The m, on the other hand, is what we call slope. We can also give it another name, gradient. And we usually calculate it by something called the rise over run. Now, what is rise over run exactly? Well, rise over run, if you have a graph, and let's say you have a point at 1, 1, and another point at 2, 3. Okay, so if you connect these lines, so I have a point at 1, 1, and another point at 2, 3. And just in case, this is the x, this is your y. This is your x, this is your y. Now, when we talk about rise over run, this is basically another way of saying the change in y over the change in x. In fact, math usually gives these a symbol. The word change is usually written as this little triangle thing. It's called delta. Okay, now, how do we find out the change in y? Well, you'd have to look at your graph, and when you look at your graph, you look at what's happening from left to right. That's how you read your graph. And what's the first point you see as you're traveling? As you're traveling, the first point you see is this point. And the next point you see is this point. So this is the first point you see. This is the second. Okay? So what does this all mean? The first point you see, you'd label your x and y there as x1, y1. Why? Because it's the first point you saw. And the second point, you'd label it as x2, y2. Again, that's because it's your second point. So what do I do with this information? Well, you find your change in y by seeing y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. How would I do this graphically, though? Well, graphically, again, we called it rise over run. So 1, 2, oops. 1, 2, so you're going here. Rise over run basically says, how far did you go in your x, and then how far up did you go with your y, or down? So in this case, you can see that from one point to the other, I went to the right by 1, and I went up by 2. Which means my next point would be, if I went to the right by 1 and up by 2, my next point should be here. So rise over run in this case would be, I went up by 2, so positive 2, and I went to the right by 1. So my slope should be 2 over 1, or more accurately, 2. So I know I have a lot on the screen right now, but let's just put this now using the formula. So if I use the formula, so my y2 in this case would have been 3, and my y1 would have been 1. And of course my x2 would be 2, and my x1 would be 1. So the final answer here would be 2 over 1. So that is how you find the slope, graphically or using the equation. Last up, we have this b here. And the b is called the y-intercept. Now, the y-intercept is basically the point on the graph where it touches or crosses the y-axis. So I'm going to talk about this on the next page because this page is quite cramped here. Okay, so going back to this example here. So we have 1, 2, 3. This is my line. So this is my line. The y-intercept is where it crosses or touches the y-axis. Now, this is the y, this is the x. So, where does it cross the y-axis? Well, it crosses it right here. This is where it touches the y-axis. So the y-intercept here would be 0. This means my b is equal to 0. And that's why we call it slope-intercept form. So we call it slope-intercept form because it consists of your y-intercept and your slope, which you can clearly see in your equations. And that's slope-intercept form.